Welcome to the Ecology Center annual membership meeting. My name is Riaz Kanji. I have the privilege of serving as the president of the Ecology Center's board of directors. The plan had been to celebrate the center's 50th anniversary over a series of events this year, culminating in a major celebration this fall. But of course, nothing this year has gone according to plan. And we will save the celebrating for later when we can all convene in person. But celebration aside, there is a great deal to discuss, to talk about this year, and we really appreciate your joining us for this annual meeting. The importance of the work that the Ecology Center does, if anything, has come into even greater focus over the course of this year, and that work will be our focus tonight. I have had the pleasure of serving on the Ecology Center's board for 7 years, and I've always been incredibly grateful for the wonderful work that the Ecology Center staff does. But I've never been more proud or more grateful about that work than this year. I think it can be truly said that even with all of the challenges of the pandemic and having to shift to a remote virtual world, that Ecology Center staffers have not missed a beat. They have kept their focus squarely on the incredibly important work that they do. And tonight we will hear about several aspects of that work, including energy, poverty, and climate, PFAS, contamination and prevention, and lead poisoning elimination efforts. During the course of the evening, there is the chat function. Please feel free to weigh in with questions for any of our panelists or for any comments about the center. We really want to hear from you. Before we get into the substantive areas, I will just say a few words about developments with respect to the board of directors. First, unhappy news. We, as always, have to bid farewell to directors, two in particular this year. Bev Gesquire has served on the board for 9 years. She has served as the board's treasurer. Many of you know Bev. She's just a wonderful, thoroughly decent human being, and has approached her service on the board with such great care and thoughtfulness, and we will all truly dearly miss Bev. Margaret Kephart is also leaving us. Margaret is a person of tremendous enthusiasm and passion. She brought that to her Ecology Center board service, served most recently as secretary, and as with Bev, we will greatly miss her as well. The Ecology Center board is truly a family. It's a wonderful group of people who come from many different perspectives and walks of life, but share, and you see them on the screen here. I won't take the time to introduce everyone by name, but we all share a real passion for the work of the Ecology Center and just a tremendous amount of respect and gratitude for the work that the center does, and we see firsthand the commitment that the Ecology Center staffers devote and the results of that commitment, and we are all so much better off for it. And we thank collectively, we thank the center for the great work. The happy news is we are welcoming 2 new board members. I'm really pleased to announce that we will be joined on the board by Jackie Victor and Carlene Colvin Garcia. Jackie and her business, Avalon Bakeries, have become a community institution in Detroit, and we know she will bring some very valuable perspective to bear. And Carlene has been a dynamic force with respect to Ann Arbor sustainability initiatives, and we will benefit greatly from her expertise. And huge thanks to both of them for lending their talents and their time to the board in the upcoming years. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Mike Garfield, who is known to everyone, does not really need an introduction. I will just say that as the director of the Ecology Center, Mike demonstrates such wonderful tenacity, dedication to the organization, serves as its institutional memory, as a wonderful leader. And as president, I get to interact with Mike frequently, and just the depth of his knowledge and of his commitment never ceases to amaze. So thank you all again for joining us, and I'll turn the mic over to Mike now.
Oh, thank you, Riaz. It's great to be with everybody, all of you today. See if I can get my computer working right. It's great to be here. It's great to be with all of you, even if we're limited to these screens on our computers. I miss seeing everybody in person, all of you who support the organization so much. And some of you who are here today have been supporters of the Ecology Center for decades. We hope you're all managing okay through the pandemic. Our heart goes out to you and to your loved ones. It's been a very hard year for so many of us. It's been no easy year for the Ecology Center either. As Riaz said, we postponed all the 50th anniversary events and commemorations this year in light of the pandemic. We're living through this regrettably unforgettable history right now, and we thought the present day events deserved our undivided attention. You know, as scientists learned about COVID, they learned that air pollution exacerbates its impacts. As they learned about COVID's toll, we learned that it mirrors and it worsens the impact of pollution, contamination, and the climate crisis, and it is deadliest in communities of color and amidst poverty. We learned that poverty, race, and environmental injustice are pre-existing conditions that make the virus that much more deadly. Most of our work this year, most of the Ecology Center's work this year reflects these realities. I want to highlight a few great initiatives we've undertaken this year, in addition to what you'll hear about in more depth from our staff in just a minute. A little over a year ago, our community-based science, environmental education, and Detroit organizing staff launched a unique science activism project in Detroit, based on a network of interconnected low-cost air monitors in the city. We work with schools and community partners to install the monitors, generate local air quality data, and educate students and adults about using the information to protect their community. Our Recycle Ann Arbor sister organization won approvals to redevelop the city of Ann Arbor's recycling sorting facility, so that, unlike what happens in many other communities, recycling there will pay its workers a living wage, won't add to the plastic pollution problem in Asia or in the oceans, will make a big contribution to solving the climate crisis, and will save the city of Ann Arbor a lot of money. And we co-founded a new national organization to fight for these principles and policies at the federal level. And also in Ann Arbor, we led the campaign to unanimously adopt and fund a carbon neutrality plan, the A20 plan, which would eliminate net carbon emissions in the community by 2030 with a priority on health and equity. It's in support of the principles behind that plan that we're helping campaign to pass Proposal C for affordable housing on the local election ballot. We've carried on new product testing studies this year, lobbied the Michigan Public Service Commission to reduce pollution from vehicles, and taught thousands of school kids about the environment, even during remote learning. I am so grateful to all of you for supporting us through this year. In spite of everything around us, we've broken new ground in our program work, and your support for our climate fund, for legacy giving, for general operations has been absolutely tremendous. I'm sure everybody here is following the federal election closely and understand that the outcome of the race for president and US Senate will have enormous implications for US policy on the climate crisis, toxic pollution, environmental justice, and all the issues we care about. But there's a lot more on the ballot too. It's hard to remember that our system delegates so much authority to the states especially on some of the most pressing issues in Michigan. We're going to spend the rest of this program hearing from 3 Ecology Center leaders about energy poverty, lead poisoning, and PFAS contamination. I'm going to introduce all of them right now, after which they'll each brief you on their respective topic. We'll have time for discussion after their remarks. If at any time while they're speaking or during the Q&A, but if at any time you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please write it down in the chat. And now let me introduce our speakers. Alexis Blisman is the Ecology Center's Legislative and Policy Director. Alexis gave up a promising legal career to work in progressive politics and policy, and she's worked for the Ecology Center on climate, energy, and environmental policy issues since 2011. Rebecca Munich is the Ecology Center's Deputy Director. Becca has led many of our campaigns on toxics and environmental health over the last decade, and she both helped establish and currently serves on Michigan's Child Lead Exposure Elimination Commission. And Mara Herman is the Ecology Center's Health Policy Specialist. Mara participated in the very first cohort of fellows in the Ecology Center's Health Leaders Fellowship Program 5 years ago. On our staff, she went on to coordinate the fellowship program and to provide an environmental health voice in Lansing. Again, please use the chat to write out questions and comments for any of the 3 of them. And now let's start with Alexis Blisman. Alexis?
Yep, I'm going to start sharing my screen. There it goes. Okay, so I just want to first, as Mike said, obviously the federal elections are critical, and depending on the results, the Ecology Center will be ready to either go on, defense and continue the defensive work that has been necessary for the last several years, or be ready to really ramp up our activity around some great federal policies and try and push the envelope to make the federal government more responsive, especially to things like the climate crisis. But there's a lot that's happening at the state level. And every election cycle, the Ecology Center engages in candidate education, where we send letters to everybody running for office with a platform that we lay out and materials, and meet with various candidates throughout the election cycle, and then post-election with some of the newly elected legislators to try and talk about some of the priorities for the next year. I'm going to talk about some of the climate and energy priorities. This is focused predominantly on the legislature, but all of us are doing work across many sectors. There's work going on with the administration. There's work going on with different administrative offices like the Michigan Public Service Commission. There's market work happening. So there's a lot happening, but this is going to focus more on the legislative priorities. And even a few of these things, there's still potential for some movement in lame duck, although most of them we think are going to be happening in 2021. And depending on the outcome of the state legislative elections, we could have a split legislature, or we could continue to have a solid Republican legislature with a Democratic administration. Either way, a lot of these policies do have some bipartisan support, and we see some opportunities in the next year. So I'm going to start just with one mention of something administrative, which is earlier this, well, I guess the end of September, Governor Whitmer took action to support climate action. She issued executive orders and executive directives with a goal of decarbonization in Michigan by 2050 and creating a Michigan Healthy Climate Plan. All of these are supposed to just created a climate council, which she will be naming people to over the next several weeks. And they're going to be working to provide strategies and recommendations for achieving the carbon emission decreases across several sectors, including in energy generation, building sector, and in transportation. And the Ecology Center is actually going to be working across all of these sectors to try and make a difference. So some of the major policies, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but some of the major policies that we'll be working for over the next year. In 2016, the Michigan legislature passed a new energy law, which included energy efficiency or energy waste reduction standards for electricity and natural gas. Those standards are set to sunset in 2021. So a major policy piece for 2021 is going to be trying to make sure that those standards are extended and even increased, because we know that there's more energy efficiency that can be achieved than what the utilities are even doing now. What we know is that in states that eliminate these standards, the utilities stop meeting them. So we need to make sure that we're extending the standards in order to ensure that we can save energy, which means less generation, and that gives way for more generation from renewables and stops sort of the extension of natural gas and stops us from being locked into natural gas for 40 years. We need to stop carbon emissions. The other big, broad policy is strengthening the renewable energy goals. Those were also put in the 2016 legislation, but were not aggressive enough. We want to get them more in line with the governor's executive order, with some midterm goals, but also some long-term goals to make us carbon neutral by 2050. Another important piece of that is eliminating barriers for distributed generation. And the most critical piece, and this is the one piece that may actually come up during even lame duck, is right now there is a cap, a 1% cap with the utilities of rooftop solar, meaning that basically only 1% of their capacity, has to be paid out on the scale. I apologize, I have a toddler in the background. Only 1% of their capacity has to be paid out according to their schedule right now. Anything that hits over that half will then be paid out at about half the price. By leaving that cap in place, basically we are killing the solar industry in Michigan. The incentive to then install solar on rooftops becomes minimal because the payoff rate is so low and the payback is so long. In the transportation sector, we're working in a couple areas, vehicle electrification being the top priority. Another executive directive from Governor Whitmer establishing the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification was issued earlier this year, and that's to guide policy recommendations to ensure that Michigan remains a world leader in autonomous and vehicle electrification. We're really working on the vehicle electrification side. The first piece being expanding EV charging infrastructure. We still need to get to the point where people are comfortable, feel that they have places to charge along the routes wherever they are. There were already bipartisan bills introduced in the House and Senate to establish an electric vehicle council, to develop an infrastructure plan. Additionally, allowing the state to install space for charging stations and state park and ride state parks, and incentives for small businesses and multifamily housing. Another piece, and this is one that our Climate and Energy Director, Charles Griffith, has been working on for quite a while, is trying to eliminate the prohibitive registration fees that discourage EV purchases. Right now, EV registration fees are tied very much to the gas tax, and there were additional fees put on both hybrids and electric vehicles in order to make sure that they were sort of making up for the gas taxes that they weren't paying. But what's happened is if the gas tax were to go up, then those fees become really exorbitant and discourage the purchase. It also hurts in the used car market as EV purchases, meaning that EVs are really going to be not accessible to those who do not have higher incomes. So we're trying to figure out new formulas to get rid of those fees. And then the third piece, and this goes both to the state and at the municipal level, I said we're working across several levels, is to incentivize EV purchases, especially around light duty vehicles and buses. There's some work being done on school buses. This can make a big difference. This also matters when you have high traffic communities who are breathing in the pollution from the buses. This can help improve air quality. And then we'll be working on that at the state level, but there are other pieces too. In transportation, additionally, we need to work on public transportation. And obviously, this has been a rough year for public transportation. I know that many of you have watched Ecology Center work on public transit issues over the last several years. We're involved with the campaigns in Ann Arbor and Washoe County, but also in the campaign for regional transit. When regional transit failed in 2016, we set about to try to expand or move toward some solution so that we could put it on the ballot again in 2018 and 2020. We know that now things have changed a little bit. Macomb County is not going to jump into any kind of regional transit. And so that means that we're going to have some sort of legislation, either a change to the Regional Transit Authority legislation or some sort of enabling legislation that will allow other counties to create some sort of different authority. That was actually in motion early in 2020 when the pandemic first hit. So obviously running an expansion for a public transportation campaign was not going to be an easy thing to do this year, and we were unable to move something through the legislature. But we're aiming again for something on the ballot in 2022, and many of the transit advocates have been working together to try and move this forward in the legislative portion in 2021. Another big piece that's really important, though, is ensure that the budgets that do exist are maintained for existing public transportation. Public transportation took a hit this year, and the budgets need to be maintained not only, even if ridership is down, there's still safety protocols that need to be put in, and any cuts that happen tend to be more permanent. We want to ensure that that doesn't happen. Last topic area is the area of energy poverty. As Mike suggested, COVID has been terribly hard on those who are already impacted by issues of poverty and pollution. And so a lot of our work this year has switched its focus to really dealing with energy assistance and energy payment, as well as the long-term solutions around energy poverty. What's happened over the years is the money has gone toward energy assistance, but not much has gone toward the energy efficiency or energy waste reduction. And so that doesn't get anybody out of a cycle of poverty. They can't pay their bills, they just end up with assistance that ends up, keeping them in that cycle. So one of the things we're doing is looking to increase the amount of dollars through the Michigan Energy Assistance Programs and the weatherization program to actually cover more energy waste reduction and efficiency work within homes. We also, just COVID related, have worked and will continue to work to stop any energy and water shutoffs during the duration of the COVID emergency. The water shutoffs were part of Governor Whitmer's executive orders, which were overturned by the Supreme Court. There is something pending in the legislature, but it hasn't happened yet, and we're going to continue to fight for that. The other big thing is developing income-based utility rates and payment plans that can serve people no matter what their income level and regardless of their energy provider. This has to be done through the legislature because the Public Service Commission only regulates some of the utilities. And then also creating some sort of minimum standards for utility payment plans based on actual ability to pay. And then finally, a big piece of our agenda for the next year is the creation of a health and safety fund. A lot of energy efficiency work isn't getting done because the utilities and the weatherization folks have to walk away from different projects because of the conditions of the home. Michigan has some of the oldest housing stock. They run into issues like roofs that have leaks, which then create mold, and there's water issues. Asbestos, lead is obviously an issue when dealing with windows. Often there are structural issues as well. Over the last year, we've worked with both consumers and DTE to develop pilot programs within their EWA, energy waste reduction programs. But those are very small pots of money, and we'll probably in these pilots address about 200 houses per utility. It's been estimated that about 56% of households are actually that are eligible for weatherization are actually being deferred. So what we've proposed is to create a fund within the Department of Health and Human Services to address the health and safety issues that would then allow the energy waste reduction and weatherization measures to go forward. The great thing about the pilots is they're actually proving out some of this work, and we're seeing improvements in health, and we're seeing improvements in comfort, and that also leads to resiliency when dealing with issues of climate. So those are all the main issues that we are dealing with on the climate and energy side. There's certainly going to be many more and many that come up, but this is what we've been talking to candidates and we'll be talking to newly elected legislators about in the near future. And so I will now turn things over to Rebecca Munich, who's going to talk. Oh, sorry. I'm going to turn things over to Mara Herman, who's going to talk about PFAS. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Alexis. Just give me one quick second to pull up my slides here. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about PFAS and some of the work that we've been doing over the past year and what we'll be working on going into 2020. So just for starters, when I say PFAS, I'm referring to per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So it's a class of thousands of chemicals. They're known as forever chemicals because of their strong carbon fluoride bonds, don't break down in nature, and they can build up in fish, wildlife, and in our bodies. So there's many uses of PFAS. It can be found in a variety of everyday consumer products like clothing, cosmetics, carpeting, and nonstick cookware. And how does it get into the environment? So once they're released into the environment, they don't typically break down, and they're also highly mobile, meaning that they can travel far distances. So a couple different ways in which they do get into the environment. So as it's listed here, chemical manufacturing, runoff from contaminated PFAS-containing fire foam use, water discharge, etc. So how does it get into the human body? One of the big and largest ways in which PFAS gets into the human body is consumption of contaminated food or drinking water. The Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, or MPART, has found PFAS in bodies of water across the state. And over 2 million Michigan residents live in areas with PFAS in their drinking water sources. Other ways in which it can get into the human body are through inhalation and skin absorption. And once it's in the body, it's absorbed through the bloodstream and then is stored in organ systems, including blood, liver, and kidneys. So problems with PFAS. It can be detected in almost every American. I mentioned before that they're dubbed forever chemicals because they're very persistent and they don't naturally break down in the environment or in our bodies. And it's really hard to get rid of them. So a lot of water filtration systems can remove some long chain forms of PFAS, but they're really ineffective when it comes to removing short chain. And unfortunately, there's currently no medically proven way to remove PFAS from the human body. So health risks associated with PFAS, it's been linked to thyroid disease, high cholesterol, and even certain cancers, such as kidney and testicular cancer. Exposure to PFAS is actually of high concern when you put it in the context of COVID as well, since PFAS is linked to suppression of the immune system, as well as chronic conditions that increase the severity of COVID-19. It's also associated with reduced antibody response to vaccines. So this is a huge public health issue, not just for COVID, but for all other diseases with vaccines available. So here you can see some of the sites in which PFAS contamination is found. This shows heavy concentration of contamination sites in Michigan, and most contamination sites in the state are drinking water sites. This was taken just last month in September, and this shows specifically groundwater contamination. This doesn't include contaminated surface water, but you can see that there's a lot of sites found throughout the state here in Michigan. And then where does PFAS come from here in Michigan? So a lot of the contaminated sites were polluted by industrial processes or through the use of PFAS-containing firefighting foams. And even though companies have stopped using PFAS chemicals and made replacements, a lot of them are equally as problematic, unfortunately. And as of March 2019, Michigan taxpayers have really been the one footing the bill when it's come to cleaning up PFAS pollution in the state. So what are we doing here in Michigan? So first off, this summer, Michigan adopted new maximum contaminant level standards for PFAS chemicals in drinking water. Policy experts here at the Ecology Center helped to develop and advocate for the new standards, which apply to a couple different classes of chemicals in the PFAS family. Two of Michigan's limits for PFOA and PFNA are the lowest of any similar state-level PFAS standards around the country, and the newly regulated PFAS chemicals are found at some level in public water systems serving around 1.9 million Michiganders. The new standards will also add 42 sites to the state's portfolio of ongoing PFAS investigations. And if anyone's interested in hearing a little bit more about the new maximum contaminant level standards, I actually did an interview with Issues of the Environment discussing those a little bit more. So we can always share that if folks are interested in getting some more information about those. Another area in which there's been a lot of work being done, I mentioned PFAS-containing firefighting foam being a major contributor to PFAS contamination in the state. Back in December of 2019, the state began collecting PFAS-containing firefighting foam from fire departments and commercial airports across the state. The program is designed to collect unused foam from local fire departments and transport it to a licensed hazardous waste facility in Idaho, so it could be solidified and properly disposed of on site before it was released back into the environment. The take-back program has already reclaimed over 30,000 gallons of the toxic foam and was made permanent by the adoption of House Bill 4389, which the Ecology Center testified for and worked with lawmakers to strengthen. The bill was signed into law by Governor Whitmer back in July and also instituted requirements for chiefs of organized fire departments in Michigan to submit an incident report within 48 hours of using PFAS-containing firefighting foam. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so other things that are going on have to do regarding PFAS-containing food packaging and food contact material. So the Ecology Center, we worked with the Mind the Store campaign, Toxic Free Future, and other partners to put out our Packaged in Pollution report. Food packaging was collected and tested for multiple popular national food chains, including both popular fast food and health-conscious brands. And we found that nearly half of all takeout food packaging tested contained potentially toxic chemicals, including PFAS. Coinciding with the report release, Senator Jeff Irwin introduced Senate Bill 1072. We worked with Senator Irwin to craft the legislation that, if it's passed, would phase out the use of PFAS-containing food packaging in Michigan. Jeff Gerhardt on our staff actually also did an interview with Issues of the Environment talking more about PFAS in food packaging and what can be done around that if folks are interested in hearing a little bit more about the work that's being done there. And then Alexis already mentioned that we have been working to educate candidates who are running at the state level. So we put together a PFAS action guide for candidates. We've also been meeting with candidates and doing what we've been calling kind of town halls to discuss PFAS, what's currently being done, what are actions that we really want to be taken up during the 2021 to ensure that everyone here in Michigan has access to safe food and water without PFAS contamination. Some of the big items that we've been discussing with them and asks of things that we really want to see moving into the next legislative session is a focus on prevention, or what we also refer to as turning off the tap. This is really vital to ensure that we're not putting out more PFAS chemicals into the environment and contaminating our water supplies, and also exposing people to PFAS. So two big things and ways in which we can do that is by banning the use of PFAS-containing firefighting foams and banning the use of PFAS in food contact materials. Another piece of that is eliminating state purchasing of PFAS-containing products, especially when they're not essential or safer alternatives exist. Other things we want to see really has to do with funding, so providing adequate funding for PFAS testing and remediation of contaminated sites, and treatment funds to provide safe drinking water to Michigan residents. Creating a public database and maps of all known contamination sites along with test results and making that available so folks can know. Establishing state medical monitoring and biomonitoring programs that will either be paid for by insurance or parties responsible for contamination, and then holding polluters accountable. Like I mentioned before, Michigan taxpayers have really been the ones that have been footing the bill for cleaning up PFAS pollution, and so we need to be making sure that we're holding the polluters accountable and that they're the ones paying for it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Becca.
Terrific. Give me 1 second to share my screen. So again, I'm Becca Munich. I am the Deputy Director at the Ecology Center, and I've been looking, and there's some terrific questions coming in, and so I want to let folks know that we will have time and we'll answer all the questions towards the end of the panel. What I want to focus on is the work that we've been doing on lead over the last couple of years, and particularly what we've been doing to educate candidates on the fact that lead poisoning hasn't gone away and is still really a critical issue in Michigan. So as you can see by this map here, lead poisoning is really a state crisis. There's often a conception amongst lawmakers, particularly new ones, that lead poisoning is an urban issue. They've heard about lead poisoning rates in Detroit or in Flint and other places, and indeed, those are very high. But as you can see on this map, there are high rates of lead exposure, elevated blood levels among children in all corners of our state. So this is something that we show to lawmakers to let them know that this is an issue that more likely is something that's happening in their district, and that children in their district their lives are being impacted by this. Why is it all over our state? That's largely because our housing stock, as Alexis alluded to, is really quite old and in some cases really run down in the state. About 70% of homes in Michigan were built before 1978, and that is when lead paint was banned in paint used for homes and things along those lines. And so unfortunately, you have an old crumbling housing infrastructure, in many places around the state where you have very high levels of lead in the paint, and that's chipping off, that's coming on the outside of the home, in the drip line of the home, or in the inside of the home, around the windows and doors and floors as things are chipping off the walls. So you can see a couple of numbers there. The state has been a little bit behind on some of their data for the number of children that have tested positive. We do have final information for 2016. We are awaiting the finalized information for the last couple of years, that over 5,000 children of the children tested that were found to have elevated blood lead levels. Now, we're only testing about 20% of children in Michigan for elevated blood lead levels. So that number is likely much higher. And I'll get to this a little bit later when I talk about some of our policy proposals, that it's important for us to know the extent of the problem by actually testing children to make sure that no one is falling through the cracks here. Many of the communities across the state have alarmingly high levels of lead poisoning. And again, that can come from a number of different exposure pathways. We certainly have heard about lead in water, and that's a critical exposure pathway. We're learning more about communities across the state that are facing this right now that are over their areas of exceedance for the new lead and copper rule that Michigan has, which is a good step in the right direction, and the need to replace the lead service lines and lead fixtures that are in many of, again, our older homes. But lead poisoning often also comes from soil and lead paint in homes, and that's something that we want to make sure we're not losing attention on as we go forward. Because lead exposure from really any source has the same impacts, and they're quite detrimental to both the children impacted and to our state overall. So as you can see here, that you'll have a likely 4 to 7 point decrease in IQ for every 10 micrograms per deciliter increase in blood lead level. They've been linked lead exposure, there's no safe level. It's been linked to a number of different negative health impacts like hypertension, hearing loss, ADHD. Around over 20% of ADHD cases have been linked to elevated blood lead levels and lead exposure, kidney damage and other organ damage, and so on and so forth. They've also been associated with additional aggression, hyperactivity, bullying, and things that harm children when they're trying to habituate in school, when they're going on later in life, and they may have higher levels of juvenile delinquency or adult crime because they're not making good decisions in the moment because of lead exposure. This is a report that came out in 2018 by our friends at Alterum Institute, based right here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I encourage folks to go to this website and poke around a little bit, valueofleadprevention.org. And what they did is they did a state-by-state comparison of different lead exposure information and the cost of lead exposure in different states. Unfortunately, Michigan has some of the highest rates of lead exposure amongst children in the country, and that's likely because of, again, our older crumbling housing stock, our history of heavy industrial production that may lead to lead contamination in communities, demolition where you have lead dust kicking up in communities right now and things along those lines, as well as an older infrastructure in terms of lead pipes and fixtures within homes and communities. So you can see the total cost for the lifetime economic burden was calculated in Michigan to be over $2.3 billion. So this is something that we show in other analyses of costs of lead exposure to lawmakers that, for one reason or not, are not necessarily compelled by the moral argument that we need to protect our children and protect their health from this toxic chemical. We put some dollars and cents to it. And so we look at the costs of diseases like lead exposure and the impacts of that, and what we're really losing as a society, what we're losing in taxpayer dollars that are not coming into the state because someone's ability to earn is impeded over the course of their lifetime because their IQ levels are lower than they might have been. And so that's one of the things that, we want to make sure we're addressing and we're talking to lawmakers about. There's a number of different analyses that we point to that have specific information. One the Ecology Center did in 2016 also looks at costs of juvenile delinquency and crime rates, special education rates, and so on and so forth in the state of Michigan. And so we can point to those numbers and make the case even stronger in that way. So I want to move towards talking about some of the solutions. Actually, I realized I messed up some of my slides, and so we'll have the lead and COVID one. I'll do that one first, and then we'll move back. One of the things that I wanted to mention, and that you've heard from Mara and you've heard from Alexis about is, and Mike even in the introduction, is that many of the issues that we work on at Ecology Center have impact or are impacted by the COVID crisis. And so unfortunately, what we've seen with lead exposure amongst children is that this isn't one of the areas that has gone unnoticed or gone unscathed by the COVID crisis. Unfortunately, because like many folks, parents weren't taking their children to doctor's offices for their regular well child visits. Many WIC offices have limited services right now during the pandemic and so on. childhood testing for elevated blood lead levels has declined in the state of Michigan. And this is something that we and our partners in the Great Lakes Lead Elimination Network that we founded a couple of years ago with partners from all of the Great Lakes states that are working on addressing lead exposure are thinking about. How do we make sure that children are getting tested, that they're going in for their child visits, that they're going in not only to get their lead tested, but for their vaccinations and so on and so forth. So we have these wraparound public health services. And then bringing that back to our departments of health and human services in our individual states. Another thing that we've noticed is that children may be having higher exposure to lead in their homes because they're now spending all of their time or majority of their time at home, where they used to be traveling to school, they used to be maybe going to grandma and grandpa's and places like that, where they may not have the same levels of exposure if they're living in a home that has lead hazards within it. And so this is something that we're concerned about. We don't necessarily have the data yet. We're pretty early, and because we're not getting children tested, it's difficult to know this. But we want to make sure that families know that, when you're cleaning for COVID, you should also be using lead-safe cleaning practices like wet cleaning and things along those lines to make sure that you're protecting your children from lead exposure in the home. Another area that we're concerned about, and then I'll move back to the slide before this, is the stagnation of water in institutions, particularly schools and daycares, especially when those have been closed down for quite some time. So Ecology Center and our partners in the Filter First campaign have been communicating with Michigan's Return to Learn Commission and members there to ensure that we are actually making sure that children are not going to be exposed to high levels of lead when they return to school. One of the ways that we think it's really important to do this is to make sure that we're putting in filtered drinking water stations, or hydration stations as they're typically called, in schools. And so I'll move back for a moment there. One of the things that we've been calling on lawmakers to do since around end of 2018 is make sure that we're passing legislation to require filtered drinking water stations are placed in every school in the state of Michigan and paid for. So the schools are not on the hook for this without additional funding for it, to make sure that there's funding for installation and maintenance. And now with the overlay of COVID, so if you go back to this one for the solutions, making sure that maybe there are options that are touch-free, where children aren't touching a drinking fountain or putting their mouths on something, but they're filling up a water bottle and it's touch-free, so there's no exposure to viruses that way. So these are some of the things that we're talking about with the administration, with lawmakers. We expect new versions of the schools bill to be introduced as early as next week in the Senate here in Michigan. There's a possibility that it may pass in this legislative session. If not, we will be working again with a bipartisan group of lawmakers, bipartisan and bicameral in both the House and the Senate, to have those bills reintroduced next session. So that leads me to some of the other policy proposals that we have. One of the things I talked about, of course, is our lowered rates of testing during COVID. One of the things that's really important from our perspective is that we have universal blood lead testing for all children at 1 and 2 years of age. The reason why we're looking at that group, that age group, is because that's when children are really learning to explore their environment and their world by crawling. They exhibit a lot of hand-to-mouth behavior, picking things off the floor, putting things in their mouth, and that's a natural, healthy way for kids to learn and explore their world and to develop. Unfortunately, that also increases the rates of exposure to toxic chemicals like lead. So if they're lead chips, lead paint chips, or lead dust, or lead contaminated soil in a place that a child is crawling around and putting things in their mouth, they may have that exposure as well. One of the areas that we want to move the state in, while it's very important that we continue to test children, is that we start testing homes for lead exposure, so that kids aren't really the canary in the coal mine here, where we're testing them and then finding out that there is actually a lead hazard in a home. So one thing that we are calling for is requiring a lead inspection risk assessment in all homes when the property is transferred via lease, or when the property is transferred via sale. So if you've ever sold a home before you've had your inspections and things like this. So putting that on the list to make sure that this is mandated, that you're looking for these hazards, lead hazards in homes at the time of point of sale, or of course in lease. And the reason we bring up lease is because unfortunately, children who live in rental housing are much more likely to be lead exposed than children who live in owner-occupied homes. And that's again, often because of the fact that they may be living in homes that have some of the issues that Alexis talked about, deteriorating housing stock, chipping paint on the walls or windows because of moisture and things along those lines. So we want to make sure that we're shifting the burden of proof to landlords to prove that a home is lead safe before it is rented to a family, and to make sure they are fixing and disclosing any lead hazards in a home and before they're renting it out and continuing to expose children. Unfortunately, what we've seen in certain areas is that, year after year, sometimes decade after decade, children are exposed in the same property to lead. And so the hazards have not been cleaned up. In some places, there have been some ways to stop this and move this forward. The city of Detroit has some good local policies right now, and Grand Rapids is working on some as well. But we do need a statewide solution to make sure that landlords are taking care of their properties and protecting the children that live within them. I think Mike mentioned that I serve on the Childhood Lead Exposure Elimination Commission. I'm proud to do so with other activists, health professionals, public health experts, education experts, and others across the state. And we have come up with an action plan in 2018, and we have our new plan coming into the next year, coming out soon. To look at what are the different policies and practices that our state needs to implement in order to protect children from lead exposure. So I encourage you to take a look at those links. Again, a couple of folks had asked early on, will we share these slides, and we're happy to do so. We're going to be running into budget season soon in Lansing, even though it just wrapped up, and it's going to be a tight budget year because of lowered revenue amounts due to COVID and a lot of different asks of the budget. So we'll be working hard to make sure that lead is still something that our lawmakers are considering and still gets the attention and priority it needs. If we look back at the dollars and cents from a couple of slides ago, we know this is a costly problem if we don't address it. So we have to take action now, which will pay off dividends in the end when our children are protected from lead exposure. And I talked about filter first, that's the last thing on the list here. And so I just wanted to mention that again. We're hopeful that that will pass and that we will have filtered drinking water stations in schools and daycares across the state of Michigan. And I will end the show and stop sharing and pass this back.
Thank you, Becca. Thank you, Mara. Thank you, Alexis. That was terrific. We've got time for comments and questions from the audience here, and some responses from our panelists here. We've already got a few questions queued up in the chat, and I'd encourage anybody else who wants to direct a question or a comment to Becca, Alexis, or Mara, or me, to write it out in the chat. I'm going to start with a question that Jeff Olson posed to Alexis about vehicles in California. In California, where they do things that we don't even consider doing in Michigan sometimes, Governor Newsom has announced that the Air Resources Board will develop state regulations to ban new cars and SUVs that run on fossil fuels by 2035. And so he's asking if this is within the realm of reasonableness to broach with the Whitmer administration, or at least something along these lines.
Sure. So I can give you, the short answer is it's unlikely to happen. There are a lot of competing interests around this. Certainly, pushing to ban new fossil fuel cars should be part of the long-term plan as the different commissions that the governor has created for dealing with electrification and advanced mobility, as well as the Climate Council. This should be part of the mix in the discussion. We're very happy that the governor took these actions and is, taking the climate crisis seriously and trying to push Michigan forward. But it's really the responsibility of, all of us in the environmental organization and everybody who cares about these issues to continue to push the administration. We would like her to go forward, and this issue, no matter what happens at the federal level, the states have to be a big part of the solution. So I think there will be further discussion about, at least an even further reduction of fossil fuel cars, maybe not a complete ban by 2035, but I think we all need to be aggressive and try and push this as far as we can.
You see how Alexis didn't even miss a beat when Finn joined on camera with me.
No, it's the screaming toddler in the background that gets me at my house.
It'd be amazing. It's really an amazing thought that Jeff raises here, but it's one we'll probably be facing in Michigan, that the home of the internal combustion engine and motor vehicle in Michigan would start to talk about issues like converting from our fossil fuel-based transportation source. Really glad that you raised that issue with us, Jeff. It's one we think a lot about. So let's move on to some talk about energy efficiency. Jackie Victor mentioned how it's great. It's great that you, Alexis, mentioned work about stopping water shutoffs, low-income based energy plans, and the DHSS fund for health and safety issues. Can you talk about whether there's a connection between that energy efficiency and energy poverty work and the lead poisoning issues that Becca was talking about?
Sure. The short answer again is there should be, and there's not enough. One of the things that we've been working on, there's a low-income energy waste reduction work group at the Public Service Commission that we've been very active in since the beginning. And one of the things we've been working on is with Michigan 211 and some of the different community action agencies trying to actually get all of these issues that come up in homes connected. When somebody goes in and discovers lead, they should also be, noticing when there are other health and safety issues or possibilities for energy efficiency, and they should be in contact with the utilities. Also, the service lines, when people are running into, issues like, bill payment issues or shut-off notices, and the utilities are going in, they should be noticing, we can't do something because there's lead in the paint or there's lead in the window sills. And so we've been working really hard to make connections between all of these agencies and all of the services for low-income residents in Michigan, so that there's sort of a one-stop shop and a single application to get people access to all of these services. But actually, there are several available out there, but it's so hard for people to get the information they need and to get connected to the right people.
I think one thing that I would add to that is just building off what Alexis said is this is an interesting intersection of our work at the state level and at the federal level, in that a lot of the funding for lead or other programs will come from HUD and other federal entities, and they're not connected and they're not necessarily allowed to use the same funding, or you might be precluded from bundling things together. And that's something that we need to be both working on at the state level and working with our national allies to push with our Michigan delegation at the federal level as well.
Let's segue into the lead issues, and then we'll circle back to PFAS. Kathleen Michaels asked how we can stop exposing kids to new sources of lead in building and flooring, carpeting, other things, and in playground materials, which aren't painted. These things aren't considered children's products, and they're not required. It's not required that they be tested. And she mentions there's a RCRA loophole that allows these sorts of things to be used, put into consumer use and used in the economy. Becca, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, that's an excellent question, and I actually see right below her, Diane Conway, I believe it was, and I've lost my points, asked a little bit about, or mentioned that we've done a lot of testing on crumb rubber and play fields, working with partners on the East Coast and across the country, really, to look for lead in those products in particular that children may be exposed to on play fields and on playgrounds and things like that. And so our colleague Jeff Gearhart has led a lot of that testing and has spoken out about this issue. What I often do is then take his work and his studies, and my work with local entities at this point is relevant here. And I'll just touch on the outside sources and then move to the other parts of the question really quickly. And with crumb rubber and play fields, we've been working on environmentally preferable purchasing policies with cities in Michigan and really across the country. Anchorage, Alaska, for example, hopefully will pass a policy soon, where it addresses toxic chemicals as well as climate and energy, as well as waste reduction and things like that, so that cities themselves are purchasing products that don't have inherent harm to the people who live there or work there within a city. So that's one of the ways that we're tackling this. Mara did mention the procurement policy related to PFAS. I think there's a lot of room for us to think at the state level of other products where we can use the institutional purchasing dollars that the state has to make sure we're not buying products that contain other toxic chemicals. We will continue to work on different testing through our Healthy Stuff Lab for lead and for other toxic chemicals to find out what might be unfortunately recycled into new products and things along those lines. We have put out that information on car seats, for example, for the last 15 years, and we've actually seen the use of plastics that have contained things like lead or flame retardants or foams go down. And so part of that is giving information out to consumers so that they can also make choices, and then pushing the companies to do the right thing. We worked really hard on reforming our federal Toxic Substances Control Act, but didn't get it as far as we wanted to in 2016 when it was reformed. Right now, we don't see a path forward with the current administration. Perhaps with future administrations, we can improve that law and strengthen that law, which really is the law that governs all of the toxic chemicals or all the chemicals that are in the stuff that we use every day. And that's an important next step for us when we have that opportunity to do so at the federal level. Different states have passed policies on lead and other toxic chemicals in consumer products, and we are doing that as best we can in Michigan. PFAS is the area where we have the most traction right now on the consumer product side of things in Michigan.
Well, thanks. I want to remind people, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please write it in the chat. Becca, I wonder if you, or maybe if you, Mara, would want to respond to Diana Conway's question about other states that have been leaders in PFAS legislation on prevention or cleanup or other policy around PFAS.
Sure, I can kind of kick us off. There's been a lot of work that's been done in a couple of states. So there's other states that have also been passing maximum contaminant level standards in drinking water. Massachusetts just passed theirs. Washington has done a really nice job of kind of leading the way when it's come to things around PFAS containing firefighting foam and food packaging. Maine as well has also been one of the leaders. Becca, I'm drawing a blank now. Are there any other ones that have kind of been really leading the charge anywhere that you can think of?
Yeah, I would think on our priority list, we thought a lot about PFAS-containing firefighting foam, and many different states are going this way. So Washington was the first, followed by Colorado. New York recently passed a ban on PFAS-containing firefighting foam. I know I'm forgetting a few as well, but now we're starting to rack up a number of states. And while we've had this voluntary take-back program, this is a good step, but it doesn't get everything in the state. This is another sort of interconnection where we have been working with our Michigan congressional delegation in Washington, D.C. to make sure that we are actually able to really address this issue by changing rules in the FAA, so the Federal Aviation Association, to make sure that PFAS-containing firefighting foam is not the specification that has to be used for airports and things along those lines. And we've got airports in other countries that are not using this toxic foam. And something that we want to make sure both in Michigan and across the United States we can do soon. So there's a lot of different leaders on this level. I think that there was another question I saw, like, who are some of the leaders here in Michigan on PFAS in the legislature? And we luckily have a bipartisan group. We mentioned a couple of things. The bill on the Take Back program was sponsored for PFAS-containing firefighting foam, was sponsored by Sue Aller, who's a Republican and who represents the people of Oscoda, which has bad PFAS contamination related to firefighting foam there. And then Jeff Irwin, our senator right here from the Ann Arbor area, introduced just a few months ago the PFAS in food packaging and other toxic chemicals in food packaging legislation. So I think there are new folks on the horizon that may be elected that we've been talking to and meeting with that we're hopeful will take up this as an issue they're interested in. Because if you look at the map that Mara put up there, this is something where there's contamination across the entire state. And that's something that's really important for us to make sure that new lawmakers see and that they know that this is something that's affecting their constituents.
And that was the next question. Why is it that Michigan has so many PFAS contamination sites and so many more than other Midwestern states and just about any state in the country? Is it because of the extent of testing or other things?
Mara, do you want to answer that? You want me to go?
Yeah, sure. I can start off. So a lot of it does have to do with the fact that there has been a lot of testing done here in the state of Michigan. If you would have looked at those maps probably 2 years ago, Michigan was really lit up, and there were other states that didn't really have any contamination sites already on the map. And that's really just has to do with the fact that Michigan's been really proactive in testing. And now, unfortunately, as more sites are tested across the U.S., we're seeing more come back positive for PFAS contamination.
Yeah, it's extraordinary how much has been uncovered in Michigan and how important an issue that's become. I think it'll be. I think other states will begin to recognize it in the coming months and years as well. There was flipping back to the conversation Becca started about environmental purchasing policy. Kathleen Michaels asked a follow-up about just asking for more information about how we're going about establishing those policies, how others could, what's involved with it. Do you want to, Becca? Do you want to elaborate on those a little bit?
Yeah, and I just chatted out a link to our roadmap that we created last year on environmentally preferable purchasing that has a 4-step process for different cities to go through in terms of establishing, well, getting the baseline of where do you even start, establishing a policy, implementing a policy, and then the things that you need to do to make sure it's working, like tracking and training and things along those lines. So we have a lot of information already on our website. We just created a new training module that will be rolling out to cities. They're looking at it right now. We're doing a beta testing, but by the end of the year, we'll have that available as well for folks to take a look at. We're interested always in communicating and talking with folks about this. And if you're in a city across the state of Michigan or really nationwide, we work with partners in different areas of the country, and we can connect you to efforts if they are some, or help you get those going. I provide a lot of technical assistance to cities that are looking to move policies forward. And I probably can't tell you which ones, but there are at least 2 cities that I think will pass policies on environmentally preferable purchasing related to holistic policies related to toxic chemicals and not purchasing products with them, in them related to climate, related to energy consumption, and then also waste and recycled materials. And so by the end of the year, I hope to have 2 more Michigan cities on the list that we have here. There are many more that are not included.
You know, that strategy speaks to an approach the Ecology Center has tried for years, for decades to promote, which is to get at the root sources of problems and to avoid PFAS contamination by not using PFAS in commerce to begin with, to not use it in materials, and to avoid it at whenever possible. And that's true for so many other issues that become environmental problems down the road. It's so much easier to prevent pollution or to prevent carbon emissions than it is to try to clean up the problem after it's been created. So that's governed a lot of our approach on many issues over the years. If anyone has we've got a little bit of time for any more questions. If anyone else would like to put out some last question or comment for the group here, we're going to take maybe one or more, maybe one more question and answer here. And
Mike, I wanted to jump in really quickly on one of the purchasing issues.
please do.
You know, along with the municipal side, one of the things that we've been working on around this health and safety pilot with the utilities is healthy building materials. And so there's also pursuing the use of healthy building materials with the different community action agencies as these programs ramp up and the energy efficiency programs ramp up. So it's another place where sort of our climate and energy work actually overlap quite a bit with our toxic work. And then I mentioned the fleet programs. So I think we're going to learn a little bit from Becca and work on the purchasing of EV fleets for some of the municipalities as we go forward.
I think one thing we know about environmental issues is that every issue that you deal with is hitched to just about every other issue, and you can't simply disconnect one from the other. And as much as possible, we've tried to take a holistic approach to it. I think with that, we're going to call it a wrap. And I'm going to extend my thanks to everybody for joining us. Really grateful to Rebecca Munich and Alexis Blisman, to Mara Herman for sharing the work that they've been engaged in and trying to move forward in the state capitol and around the state of Michigan. I want to again thank all of you for joining in at home or wherever you are. We're really grateful for all of your support of the Ecology Center and your participation today. I am so grateful for the participation and involvement of our board of directors and the staff of the Ecology Center. It's terrific working with everybody here, and we so appreciate everybody sticking together and trying to put forward our mission during this extremely difficult year. I think everybody knows what's at stake next week. I don't need to remind anyone here to vote. I'll urge you to volunteer in the election, to do what you can, to phone bank, text bank, do whatever you can to get out the vote next week, and continue working to move forward progress on the issues that we work on together. The Ecology Center has started conducting presentations, virtual presentations on a lot of the different subjects that we work on. And the next presentation that we have that we're promoting under the banner of Ecology Center Live takes place in November. And it'll be on the topic of environmental education. That'll take place on November 18th. And I hope some of you can join us. You'll be getting messages from the organization about that as it comes up. Again, I'm really grateful for you for joining us today. We'll be sending out the slides to this program later, and want to wish you a real good night and a great rest of the week. We'll see you at the next Ecology Center event. Thank you very much.